Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot, Tachman Gimel. Today's stuff is sponsored by Adar Blicker in loving memory of her grandfather, Lenny Kunin, Leib Mordechai ben Rav Yehuda. Toward the end of his life, my Zaidi learned with my uncle, and together they finished many Masechtot. My Zaidi always appreciated that I did the daf, and it gives me great strength to continue learning Gemara like he did. Okay, we're going to get started. We have a really, really interesting daf today. Many, many interesting things. So be prepared. A bunch relating to women specifically. And I will very, very highly recommend extra content on today's daf. Gefet went up yesterday about women and the mitzvah of tzitzit. And it relates to a few different issues that we're going to talk about, which is number one, you always have to think when women are potentially exempt from mitzvah. Number one, are they exempt? Are they not? Is it time-bound? Is it not time-bound? What are the possible issues that come up? And even if it's time-bound, sometimes there's exceptions to the rule. Okay, the Gefet goes into a Tosfot, which we're not going to get to in class, but perhaps suggests that maybe it's an exception. And then the question is, if they're exempt, does that mean, though, they can opt in, right? And there were different approaches throughout the ages to different mitzvot. Like sukkah, nobody complains if a woman sits in a sukkah. But when it comes to tefillin, tzitzit, which are both different issues, by the way, there raise these questions. Are women allowed to? What are the issues that come up? So it's a fascinating issue, both in Gefet in English, which is Shalhevet Schwartz, based on Rabbi Dreyfus' shir in Hebrew, and also in Hebrew, Mirav Tuba Kahana, they both kind of really did the same shir, and it was a very different shir. So it's always interesting to hear, sometimes why they both speak about the same topic. It's such an interesting topic, and to hear the different approaches and the different sources each of them quoted and the way they went about it is also very interesting. So that's the intro. We have a bunch of interesting things in the daf besides the women. It's just a great daf. So let's get started. We started at the end of our daf. First, we're going to talk about more the techelet versus kala ilan, okay, which is this fake techelet, right? It looks like techelet, but it's not really techelet. So we ended yesterday with this braita about which things can you check, which things are not able to be checked. If you can't check them, then you can't buy them from anybody. You have to, or you should ideally buy them from an expert so that you know that it's not a forgery in some way. So we assumed when we read the techelet en la b'dika, we thought it meant you can't check to tell the difference between techelet and kala ilan. But now the Gemara is going to say, of course you can. That doesn't make any sense. We're going to now quote a whole bunch of people who give these suggestions, two people who give suggestions about how to do the check. So starting from two lines from the end of Mem Bet Amud Bet, u'techelet en la b'dika, v'harav Yitzchak b'rei Rav Yehuda badikle. He would check it, okay? How would Rav Yitzchak, the son of Rav Yehuda, check it? Maite magbi agile. He would take this kind of type of clay, umaya deshavlavita, water with fenugreek, umeme raglaim, urine, ben arba'im yom, that sat around for 40 days. Okay, we were always a little disgusted when we talked about the urine, but it was really a substance they used a lot in those days. Uvitare le begavayu. Now you take the substance that you want to check, the wool that you want to check, whether thread or a piece of swatch of wool, whatever it is. You want to check it to see the color. So it's a dyed wool. You put it and soak it in that mixture, those three items. Me'or tabad tzafra, from night to morning, right? Overnight, right? There's all these recipes. Soak it overnight, and then take it in the morning. Ipared chazute psula. If it starts fading, the color faded, okay? By the time you get to the morning, the color's faded, it's a fake. It's not, right? It's kala ilan. Lo ipra chazute kshera. But if it didn't fade at all and the color's still very strong, then it's techelet. You see now why techelet was the color and not kala ilan, because kala ilan was a weaker color. Rav Ada kamei de Rava mishmei de Rava Via Amar. Now we're going to have a different type of test. Maite chamira arkasa desare. Take hard leavened barley dough. Ve'afe lebegavayu, and bake them together. Ishtanai lamal yutak shira. So in other words, you put the swatch on top of the dough. Bake it in the oven. Ishtanai lamal yutak, if the color changed for the better, kshera, it's good. Ligriyuta, if it got worse, psula. V'simanech, and here's how you remember: shinoi sheker, shinoi emet. Okay, a change for fake, and a change for a lie, and a change for truth. In other words, it depends on how it changes. It could be a lie, it could be true. So if it's good, then it's true. If it's bad, then it's not true. Okay, so now we have a problem because we have two ways that you can test it. So what do you mean, right? You can't test it. So my ein labedika nami dekama atiima. If you remember, by the tefillin, for example, we said You can check to make sure the letters or the words are written properly, but you can't check if the hide was prepared lishma or not, right? We don't know whether the hide was prepared properly or not, with the right intent, with the intent for the mitzvah. Same thing here. We can know whether it's techelet or ilan. Okay, I don't know if you want to try those tests at home, but theoretically you could figure that out if you wanted to check. But we don't know whether the threads were prepared lishma or not, right? Whether the dye, whether it was dyed. Yesterday we talked about also maybe it needs to be spun lishma. But even if it doesn't need to be spun lishma, it does need to be dyed for the sake of the mitzvah and not dyed as a tester. Remember? So when you buy tzitzit, you have no idea what they use the strings, how they dyed them. Did they dye them as tests and then stick them in your tzitzit or not? And that's the issue. Now we're going to have a story about these tests. So we're going to move off from the braita temporarily. We'll come back to the braita soon. But now we mentioned that there were these two tests to do. So now we get a good story. Mar mi Mashke, a person from the city of Mashke, aite techelet b'shnei de Rav Achai. So we brought techelet in the years when Rav Achai was in the Beit Midrash, as the head of the Beit Midrash. But Rav Yitzchak b'rei de Rav Yehuda, they did the first test. Okay, the first one we saw with the fenugreek and the urine. V'pred chazute, and it actually got faded. So it sounds like it's not techelet. B'de Rav Ada, but then they went and tested it according to Rav Ada. Okay, I was thinking this is like when you ask your mother and your mother says no, and then you go ask your father and your father says yes, right? So it didn't pass this test, but let's try the other one. So they tried the other one, B'de Rav Ada, v'ishtanai l'mal yuta, and actually the color changed for the good, meaning it was good. So now they were completely confused what to do. And it's not really like my example of the mother and the father, because several lemifsale, they said, well, okay, not clear why they did both tests, actually. I don't think it was really they were trying to ignore the first one, because they actually thought, I guess this is no good. He says, what do you mean? According to what you're saying, it's not techelet, because it didn't pass test number one, but it's also not kali ilan, because if it was kali ilan, it would have gotten worse. Well, it's got to be either kali ilan or techelet, so he comes up with the following thing. He says, Ela shmamina, shmuata ahadade itmar. These two tests were actually referring to each other. It's not how we understood it. Test this way and test that way. You can do either one. No, they work together. How does that work? Well, the first test is do Rav Yitzchak Rav Yehuda, the first one. Lo iprid chazute kshera. Okay, if it doesn't get lighter and it stays as strong as it was, you know it's techelet. You're good to go. However, iprid chazute is like a flow chart. You go this way, you're good. You go the other way, and if it fades, well, you're still not sure it's kali ilan yet. It could be techelet. Techelet could potentially fade, but then then you use this other, the dough trick, the barley dough. Go use that. So the second test is if you fail the first test, then the second test can check whether it might still be techelet, because techelet could theoretically fail the first test, but it won't fail the second test also. So you've got to wonder then why do the first test, right? Maybe there's some reason why you do the first test. Also, maybe the second test only works after the first test. I'm not sure. Maybe the first test is just easier to do, so people do that one first and hope that they pass it, and if not, then they'll go to the second. It's a good question. I only thought of it right now. So after they went through this, and this is what Rav Achai explained, so they sent it off to other places so people know Shmuata Adadi Itmar, that really the second test was really talking about if the first one fails, go do the second one. Rav Mani Diek, okay, now we're back to the beginning, which was the braita that says the following, right? Tzitzit, you should only buy from an expert, because it could be somebody might fake, maybe will sell you strings that were used, that were dyed as testers. So we're now going to hear about Rabbi Mani. Diek v'zabin k'chumrei matniata. He would only buy like the chumrah of the braita. Okay, what we're now going to learn is that whole braita of saying only buy from an expert is a bit of a chumrah. You don't have to, but you should. It's ideal, and he would do that. And Amalu Alu Saba, this elderly person, said, Hachi avu kamai de kamach, the ones before you also did that way, va'atzlich iskayu, and they were prosperous in their business endeavors because God rewarded them, because they were extra careful about this mitzvah and only bought from reputable people. Okay, but now we're going to see the other side, which is really you can buy tzitzit from all sorts of people, and who can you buy from, who can't you buy from, who can you trust, who can't you trust? Let's see. Tanu Rabbanan. So another braita. Halokech talit mitzuyetzet min hashuk. If you buy from the market talit with tzitzit on it already, miYisrael harei bechezkata. Okay, that's not an expert. That's just any Jew. You can assume it's kosher. Now it's going to get interesting. Mina ovei kochavim. If you buy from a non-Jew, mina tagal kshera. If you buy from a merchant, which means basically the middleman, okay, who purchased from someone else and then sold it, it's kshera. Mina hedyot, but from a regular person, psula, because you can assume maybe he put the tzitzit on, and that's, again, we had this issue about whether, right, it's kasher or not if a non-Jew does tzitzit, but even if I guess you say it's kasher, we'll be concerned that it wasn't done properly. But afal pisha amruna, here's the interesting part. Even though they say, okay, there's going to be a few interesting things about this next few lines, ein adam rashad in kor talit mitzuyetzet lovei kochavim ad sheyatir tzitziotav. You're actually not allowed to sell your stuff to a Gentile, your tzitzit, unless you take out the tzitzit. If you have a 4-quarter garment and you want to sell it to a non-Jew, you have to remove the tzitzit. In a minute, we're going to see why. But before we even get to why, what they're saying is, even though you're not allowed to, okay, a Jew is not allowed to sell their tzitzit with the strings on it, right? You have to take off the strings, no strings attached. So even though you have to take off the strings, if you buy from a middleman who's a non-Jew, you can assume he bought it from a Jew. Why is that? Many Jews don't keep the halacha. In other words, even though they said, don't sell it, we still can assume it was bought from a Jew. Okay? Because who else is selling them clothes with tzitzit on it? So, therefore, fascinating, right? You can rely on, because people sin and do things they're not supposed to do, we can rely on the fact that the non-Jew probably bought it from a Jew. Okay. But now we have to understand, what's this? Why can't you sell your garment to a non-Jew with tzitzit on it? You have to take off the tzitzit. My time, what's the reason? We're going to have 2 answers, and within the first answer, we're going to have 2 explanations of Rashi. Rashi is going to bring us 2 explanations. Hachatir gama mishum zona. Here they explained it because of prostitute. Okay, we're going to hold off for a second before we explain it. Rav Yehuda amal shemig idlaveinu b'derech v'yahargenu. The second one's very easy to understand. Okay, and especially you have to think in the context of times when things were difficult, and I'll give you a modern day example, okay, an unfortunate one, but Rabbi Yehuda says, if you sell them tzitzit, they'll walk around, they'll dress up as Jews, you'll think they're Jewish, and then they might walk with you on the path, you'll think you're a Jew, you'll think you're safe, and then they'll kill you. Okay, now, obviously not all Jews are non-Jews are suspect they're going to kill us, but there were times when that would happen. Okay, unfortunately, there's terrorists who dress up as in garb that look religious and, Jewish, and, and then that's why, tramps and all those things, giving people hitchhiking rides is very dangerous in Israel sometimes because, people dress up and make themselves look and then unfortunately do terrible things. So we know this to be the case. Again, not everybody, but, you should be careful not to encourage that kind of thing. What's the prostitute? Interesting. So Rashi gives us 2 explanations. We'll read in Rashi. Mishum zona. Dil yahava le zona Yisraeli. Maybe there's a Jewish prostitute. Usfura Yisrael, and she thinks that the guy coming to her is a Jew because he's wearing tzitzit. V'tiba ele, and she'll sleep with him. V'avarya mishum lo titchaten bam, and then it's going to transgress the prohibition of don't marry them. It is very strange. First of all, we're worried about protecting prostitutes. I mean, she's already doing things that are not exactly appropriate, and now we're just trying to protect her from not sleeping with non-Jews. Okay, and lo titchaten bam means don't marry them. Don't marry them. Well, she's not marrying them. She's a prostitute. She's just sleeping with them. So it's in general an interesting commentary that this is what we're worried about zona. It does seem to be the simple reading of zona, right? The simple reading would be okay because if a prostitute, the prostitute might get confused and think they're Jewish and sleep with him. Again, better that she engage in prostitution with a Jew than a non-Jew, but the whole thing doesn't seem so great to me in the first place. Okay, so that's the first explanation. But because of the problems with all the issues I just raised in that, so Rashi has a second interpretation. Lishna achrina, mishum zona goya. We're worried about a non-Jewish prostitute. Okay, so what's the problem? Now this is going to make this answer very similar to the next answer. You'll see in a minute. Right, the one about maybe the non-Jew will walk on the street with you and then pretend they're a Jew. Here we're worried that maybe the Ovei Kochavim will give her a gift of this garment, right? Because that's how people pay prostitutes. That's what we call an etnan, right? Etnan zona, remember, can't be brought on the altar. So maybe he'll bring her an etnan of this beged, and then she'll go out and say, Ki Yisrael nitanali, va'ata lemichshadeh. she'll claim it was a Jew and she'll smear his reputation, right? She'll claim, oh, look what I have tzitzit. It sounds a lot like Yehuda, right? When Tamar pulled out, oh, look whose stuff I have. Actually very similar to that, and she'll pull it out and say, look, I have the tzitzit of this Jew, and she'll smear his reputation completely. So again, this is not, right, one is killing, and one is killing someone's reputation. So, okay, very interesting. And it could be, by the way, that she could claim it was the person who sold it, right? It might really be, right, it has name tag or something, and then she could say, oh, look, this belonged to that Jew. Tov, that's very interesting. Now we're going to move on. Rav Yehuda Rami Tchelta leparzuma de inashe beite. Now we get to the really interesting source of today's daf. Rav Yehuda would put tzitzit on, the techelet, on the clothing. The parzuma is the clothing of inashe beite. What is inashe beite? It sounds like the people in his household. But inashe beite is his wife. He would put on his wife's clothes tzitzit. There you have it. Rav Yehuda thought that women should be wearing tzitzit, and he put on his wife's garments. He did something else. And then the Gemara is going to say, wait, those two things don't go hand in hand. The other thing isn't connected to her. The other thing is mivarech kol safra litatef b'tzitzit, which sounds very simple and plain, right? We all know that in the morning, right, you put on your tzitzit, you make a bracha litatef b'tzitzit. So we also would do that every day. Okay, that sounds pretty basic. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, midirame, the fact that he put the tzitzit on his wife's garments, kasavari must have held mitzvat aseh shelo hazman gramahu. It's not a time-bound mitzvah. Now, what is a time-bound mitzvah? We often think of a time-bound mitzvah remember, women are exempt from time-bound positive commandments. We normally think of it as something that comes up, at a certain time of year, once a year, certain time of day. This is all day long, but it's not at night, okay? And that would make it a time-bound mitzvah. But the fact that he basically thought his wife was obligated, that's the assumption, that she was putting it on her beged. He thought she was obligated. So that means he doesn't think it's time-bound at all, which means that he thinks that the mitzvah of tzitzit applies all day long, not just during the day, because during the day would make it time-bound. Again, you might think all day long doesn't really sound very time-bound. You could do it any time of day, but it really, in the context of mitzvah, like tefillin also, is time-bound, because it's only during the day, not at night, and that makes it a time-bound commandment. So he must have held it wasn't a time-bound commandment. Well, that's the problem, because that doesn't go then with the fact that you would make a bracha every day. If it wasn't time-bound, you're chayav and tzitzit all the time, then you make a bracha the first time you put on the garment, and then you're done. You're just continuing to fulfill that mitzvah. So, it says, Amay mevarech kol safra v'tzafra. So why would he make a bracha every morning? So they answer Kirebi, Ditanya, Tefillin, Kozman, Shebenichan, mevarech alehen, divrei Rebbe. So he must have held like Rebbe, who says tefillin every time you put them on. Like you go to the bathroom, you put them back on, you make a bracha on them. Okay, so anytime we take off his tzitzit, he would make a bracha. And that's why he would do it every morning. So Gemara says, that doesn't make any sense. Yachi kol shatanami. It should be any time of day he took off his tzitzit, he would have to do it. Make the bracha, not in the morning necessarily. So they're obviously going to combine those two things. They're going to say, Rav Yehuda inish tzniyavi, he was very tzanua. And velo sharele leglime kuleyomi, he would never take off his garment all day long. He would only take it off at night, right? And then ma'ishna mitzafra, so why only in the morning? Some people think this question means, didn't he wake up even before dawn and put on his garment in the morning? But they say, ki mashana michsut laila lichsut yom. He might have woken up very early, but usually only in the morning do you switch your garment to the other garment. And when he switched his garment, then he would make the bracha. So basically, it's anytime he changed his garment, but he would change his garment once a day, early in the morning, and that's when he would make the bracha. And then that fits well. So now we're going to see that there's this machloket. Not everybody thinks that tzitzit is only during the day and therefore time-bound. Okay, we're going to see that's actually only Rabbi Shimon. And we hold like Rabbi Shimon, but everyone else seemed to say, or at least the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda seem to paskin that way, that it's not a time-bound mitzvah at all, and therefore women are obligated. Tanu Rabbanan. So now we're going to see another braita that says this. HaKol chayavim b'tzitzit. Everyone is obligated in tzitzit. Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. Okay, the Gemara is going to be say, what are you talking about? Of course, like, who else if not Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim? It's a little bit weird. Usually you don't say that when you say everyone's chayav. It's men, let's say, or something like that. Girim, Nashim, Vavadim. Converts, women, and slaves. Remember, this is Canaanite slaves, who are in the same category as women because they're exempt from time-bound mitzvah. Rabbi Shimon poter b'nashim mipnei shemitzvat aseh shazman gramahu. Now we get to the big machloket. Tanakama said women are obligated The second opinion says, Rabbi Shimon, women are not obligated. It's a time-bound mitzvah. V'chol mitzvat aseh shasman grama, nashim p'turot, and any time-bound mitzvah, women are exempt. Amar. So like I said before, now that we're in the topic, I'll just repeat it because it's a very important concept, which is, number one, you have to question, are women obligated or not? And there's a machloket here. Number two, and really the first question always is it time-bound, is it not time-bound? Even when it's time-bound, there are some exceptions to the rule, okay? Is this an exception to the rule? Tosfot suggests that maybe you might have thought that, but you can listen to Gefa to hear about that. But let's say you assume it is time-bound, right? There's one track that says it's time-bound. And if you say it's time-bound and we go with that, which really is the way we paskin the halacha, then women are exempt. But once they're exempt, the question is, can they do it anyway? And that raises other issues. Some people think it's kli gever, it's men's clothing, and it's a problem. Some people think it's yohora, it's being arrogant. Like you're not obligated to something, why are you doing it? Why tzitzit specifically and not, let's say, sitting in a sukkah, right? You have to start to think about, and there's no clear-cut answers to this, and there's different approaches as to, whether this is allowed for women to wear tzitzit, whether it's not. This really good quote from Rav Melamed, so rabbi, nowadays writes these books, Pninei Halacha, if you're familiar with them, and he writes that there's no reason women can't wear tzitzit, really. He doesn't think that there's any problem with it whatsoever, as opposed to Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was concerned with where it was going. The women who were wearing tzitzit, he was worried, where will that take things, and also he was it was earlier, things were in a different place at that time. So it's interesting. It's just very interesting how this changed throughout the times. That's why these extra shiurim are very, very interesting. And also just to see the sources throughout the ages. There's all sorts of approaches. Some say it's totally fine for women to wear tzitzit. Some people start making issues. Sometimes I think that the rabbis didn't make issues when there was no issue. Like maybe women weren't wearing it, so they had no problem just saying, okay, women can wear them. But because nobody was. Once women started, then they had to see, well, how do we relate to this? Anyway, right, like sukkah, I think is different because it's a family thing. Everybody sits together and eats together, and it's more, right, teshvu ke'en taduru, you're supposed to eat the way you... So anyway, there's a lot to be said about this topic. Nothing clear-cut, really. There's no clear-cut answers to any of these things, but there are approaches that you see of different rabbis and throughout the ages, and that's also interesting. Okay, and I think for sure it has to do with where they were living and what was going on around them, and what their whether women really were trying to or weren't trying to. Okay, let's the whole thing about women making brachot. Oh, that's the other question. If you do it, are you allowed to make a bracha on it? That's a whole machloket Ashkenazim Sephardim. Even within the Sephardi community, there's a big debate. Right? When you take arba minim, do you make a bracha? So some people, right, Ashkenazim do, and that's because in Ashkenaz it was common. Women were starting to do mitzvot. They were influenced by their surroundings. They started in the Middle Ages, and the rabbis responded and allowed it. In Sephardi countries, it was less common because Sephardi women weren't really doing those things. So it's just interesting how these things developed. Okay, we're going to stop here, though, because we're in a daf yomi shiur, and there's a lot more to be said about this. Okay, we have a big daf. So we're now back to this machloket. So Amar, the first thing they say is, let's just go back to that line, Kohanim Levim Yisraelim. That didn't make so much sense. Kohanim Levim Yisraelim Pshita, di Kohanim Levim P'tirei man l'chayev. If they're going to be exempt, then who's obligated? You don't need to say it like that. Well, Kohanim eat strichali. You need to say Kohanim. Why? Because it says, this whole thing we learned, you can wear tzitzit that are kilayim, even though kilayim are forbidden. You might have thought, mandalo ishtere kilayim legabe belevisha, one who can never wear kilayim, hu demachai b'tzitzit. The pasuk is telling you, don't wear kilayim, and those who don't wear kilayim actually can wear tzitzit, even though they're shanes. Right? But Hane Kohanim, you might remember this, you might not, but the big day kuna, the avneit, the belt of the Kohen, had shatnez in it. So people who are anyway permitted to wear shatnez, and the pasuk of don't wear shatnez doesn't really apply to them. Now, it does. But to a certain extent, it doesn't apply in a certain situation. Maybe they're not chayav in tzitzit because they can actually wear shatnez in a different situation. Kamash malan, therefore comes to teach you, nihidi ishtari b'idan avoda, and that's what I said before. Well, it might be permitted when they're doing the avoda, but below idan avoda lo ishtari, when they're not in the temple serving, well, you're not allowed, and therefore the pasuk does apply to them as well, and that's what the braita is pointing out. Okay, now we'll get to this machloket, Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, and what's the background, okay? Rabbi Shimon poter b'nashim. My time at the Rabbi Shimon. So where does he get it from? That women are exempt. And basically, what we have to find is, where does he get it that it's time-bound? So very simply, we're going to learn that from the words uri temoto. You have to see the tzitzit, right? It says uri temoto. I'm going to read you the rest of the next section there. Uzchartem, you're supposed to remember kol mitzvot Hashem, all the mitzvot of Hashem, v'asitem otam. And then you will do that. Okay, we won't read the rest, but that's going to be important for this whole next section. So the first part we're going to darshan is uri temoto. Prat l'chsut laila, that comes to exempt pajamas, things you wear at night, aren't obligated in tzitzit, because you don't see them. Remember, at night those days, it was dark, there were no lights, electricity, anything else, maybe a little candle, but that and people, you weren't outside. Nobody walked around outside, so nobody saw them. So that exempts ksut laila. Ata omer, right, which means it's not chayiv at night, which means it's time-bound. Okay, this is Rabbi Shimon. Obviously, the rabbis are going to have to darshan this differently, because the rabbis seem to say women are obligated because it's not time-bound. It's even at night, you're supposed to wear tzitzit. So now the braita though continues and says, maybe it means a blind person who can't see their garments. Maybe they're exempt from tzitzit. So they say, that's in the gedilim taselecha, on the four corners of your garment, that you will cover yourself with. So they say, that comes to include, if it's covering you, you're obligated even if you can't see it. So therefore that includes a blind person is obligated. So hamani makayim uri temoto. So again, you have one pasuk that limits it, uri temoto. One pasuk that expands it, asher techaseh, anything that covers you. So anything that covers you includes a blind person in the obligation, and the uri temoto, you'll see it, comes to exclude a garment from the night. So again, ela kshu omer asher techaseh ksut suma amar hamani makayim uri temoto prat l'chsut laila. Okay, that's the two. But the obvious question they always ask when they do this is, okay, you have one pasuk that's limiting, one pasuk that's expanding. Why do you limit and expand in that way? Uma ra'ita l'rabok sutsuma lo siksu laila. Okay, so why don't you do it the opposite? Say, blind person's not obligated, but your night clothing is. Well, marbani sutsuma sheyeshna b'riyah etzel achirim. Other people can see the blind person's garment. But motziani ksu laila she'ena b'riyah etzel achirim. But nobody else can see the night garment. Right? So therefore, again, either because it's dark or because you're not going around anywhere. Okay, that's Rabbi Shimon. And that all leads us to women are therefore exempt because it's time-bound. Rabbanan, who don't think that it's time-bound. Hi, asher techaseba, my avdele. So what do you do? What do they do with the words? We're going to have to explain two things. What do they do with asher techaseba? And what do they do with uri temoto? Okay, top of Amud Bet. It's needed for the following braita. Al arba kamfot ksutcha, arba velo shalosh. It says in that pasuk, first we're just starting with the beginning of the drashot, not connected to our topic, but it says on the four corners of your garment. What do you learn from here? You need four corners, not three. If you have three-corner garment, you're not obligated in tzitzit. Ata omer arba velo shalosh. Again, classic midrash halakha. You say four, not three. O eino ela arba velo chamesh. Maybe it means four, not five. Remember, we learned about the five-corner beged, and we said we'll see the source when we get to Mem Gimel. We're now on it. When it says anything that covers you, that comes to include a five-corner garment. Ha'umani makayim al arba. So what do I do with the four? Arba velo shalosh. Again, we have the exact same structure we had 2 minutes ago, which was one pasuk includes anything that covers you. One, which is exactly the same thing from before, that also it includes something additional. This is just the rabbi's drashot. We don't think it excludes the night garment. And one that excludes, okay? So asher techaseba comes to include something, and the previous Rabbi Shimon said it came to include the blind person. Here he's coming to say it comes to include the five-corner garment, and the arba, four, comes to exclude three. So again, they're going to ask, mara'ita, right? Mara'ita, l'rabot ba'ala chamesh, u'lo tzi ba'alat shalosh. Right? Why would you say four is limiting three and not four is limiting five? And maybe asher techaseba is including three. Marbani ba'alat chamesh sheyesh b'chlal chamesh arba, because five includes four. Okay, if you have five corners, you also have four corners on your garment. Right? There's also some jokes people make about those things. So, marbani ba'alat chamesh sheyesh b'chlal chamesh arba, motziani ba'alat shalosh she'ein b'chlal shalosh arba. Okay, you can't say three includes four. You could say that five includes four. You can't say three includes four, and that's why three is out, five is in. Now, for Rabbi Shimon, where is he going to get this from? He also must hold that a five-corner garment is obligated in tzitzit. So where is he going to learn that from if asher techaseba is used to include a blind person? Me asher nafka. He says, asher techaseba. The word asher is extra, so that includes also, right? We're going to have, that includes for him the 5-corner garment. V'Rabbanan asher lo mashma. The rabbis just don't think that you can darshan asher, and that's why they use techaseba for that. V'Rabbanan. Now going back to the rabbi's position. We explained so far what the rabbis do with, and let's remember, Rabbi Shimon darshan, uritemoto, to exclude the garments at night, right? You're not obligated to tzitzit at night, and asher techaseba to include a blind person. So now we had to say, what do the rabbis do with asher techaseba? And now what do they do with uritemoto? So Rabbanan, hai uritemoto mai avdele. Well, mebayalu l'chidetanya. They need it for the following braita. And now I read you that whole pasuk, or the whole next section of that pasuk, because we're now going to have a slew of drashot. Okay, really the first one's answering our question, but then we're going to bring tons of drashot on those words in that pasuk. Okay, and we're really talking about the significance of mitzvat tzitzit. Uritemoto is chartem. You're going to see them and remember. Okay, it's not about seeing them. It's important, or whether you see them at night or it's the seeing them will cause you to remember. Remember what? Right? It says in the pasuk, "Et kol mitzvot Hashem," all the mitzvot of Hashem. But we're going to have different drashot what exactly this means. Re'eh mitzvah zo, uzechor mitzvah acheret hatluya ba. You're going to see this mitzvah and remember another mitzvah that's dependent on it. What's dependent on tzitzit? Ezo. Zo kriyat shema. Now, why is kriyat shema dependent on seeing your tzitzit? Because you might remember from the beginning of Masechet Brachot, you might not. Me'ematai korin et shema b'shacharit. When do you start reading Shema in the morning? What's the earliest time? Mishiyakir ben techelet lavam. When you can distinguish between techelet and white, meaning when you can see your tzitzit and see the difference between the techelet threads and the white ones. When it's light enough for that, that's when Kriyat Shema comes. So tzitzit is there to remind you of the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. But by the way, they also say, because all the mitzvot, why is that all the mitzvot? Because Shema is all about keeping all the mitzvot. So it kind of goes together with, and you'll remember the mitzvot of Hashem. V'tanya idach, uritemoto uschartem, re'eh mitzvah zo, uschor mitzvah acheret hasmuchala. This will remind you about some other mitzvah. What mitzvah? The mitzvah that's right next to it. What's that? Kilayim. Remember, shatnes. Ve'ezo zo mitzvah kilayim. Dichtiv lo tabashanes termu fishtin yichtav dilim taselecha. Okay, so it's going to remind you of the mitzvah of shatnes. Tanya idach, which by the way, you can say is connected. It's clothes. You're wearing clothes. I don't know. Tanya idach, uritemoto uschartem kol mitzvot Hashem. So now they're going to say, Kevan shenitchayev adam b'mitzvah zo, nitchayev b'chol mitzvot kulan. What does this mean? Well, if you say that the mitzvah of tzitzit, okay, which we're going to say in a minute, this follows Rabbi Shimon's position, mitzvah tzitzit is in the morning. So when you see the tzitzit in the morning, what do you remember? It's a new day. I'm now obligated in all sorts of mitzvot. A lot of mitzvot don't go at night because you're sleeping, or they're not, the time for them is not at night. So when you see this in the morning, you remember, it's a new day. I have a lot of mitzvot to do today. And then you remember all the mitzvah. Rabbi Shimon, okay, this obviously holds by Rabbi Shimon, Da'amar mitzvat aseh shazman grama, that, the tzitzit are specifically, when you put them on in the morning because you don't wear them at night, and then that reminds you. Tanya idach, another braita about this. Uri temoto uschartem kol mitzvot Hashem. All the mitzvot, what does that teach you? Shkula mitzvah zo keneged kol mitzvot kulam. This mitzvah is equal to, we've seen many statements like this, different mitzvot that are equal to all the mitzvot. Obviously, you can't have all those together because it won't work on the scale, but this mitzvah is like all the other mitzvot. Why? Because again, this mitzvah reminds you to keep all the other mitzvot, so maybe that's why it's a possibility. Okay. Another braita. Tanya idach. Uritemoto uschartem v'asitem. We didn't really go that far yet in the pasuk. You'll remember the other mitzvot, and then you will do them. So they say, Riyah miviah lidei zchira, zchira miviah lidei asiyah. Right? The seeing, it's a process. When you see the tzitzit, it reminds you of the mitzvot. When you're reminded of the mitzvot, then it causes you to do the mitzvot. So it's a process. Now we're going to have Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Kol Zariz b'mitzvah zo, zocher mekabel pnei shechina. We're going to see another thing from this pasuk. Okay, these are just slews of drashot on uritemoto uschartem. You're actually, it's like you're greeting the divine presence. Why? K'tiv hacha uritemoto, u'k'tiv hatam. It says elsewhere, et Hashem elokecha tira v'oto tavod. You should fear God and worship Him. What they say here is tira, like uritem. It's a different, one is fear and one is seeing, but they connect the two, and that you'll see, uritemoto is basically God. You'll see God if you do this. You'll be able to greet the divine presence. Tanu Rabbanan. Chavivin Yisrael. Okay, this is one of those sources that's a little hard reading as a woman because we don't really generally do these mitzvot, although, like I said, there are some women who now do wear tzitzit, wear tefillin. Like I said, range of opinions about how to relate to that. Chavivim Yisrael shesivivan HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'mitzvot. Tefillin berashehen, utefillin bezrotehem, v'tzitzit bebigdehem, u'mezuzah lepitchehen. Okay, so beloved are the Jewish people to God, that He surrounds them with mitzvot. They have tefillin on their head and their arms. They have tzitzit on their body. They have mezuzah on their entrance to their houses. So they're completely surrounded with mitzvot. Amar David, Sheva bayom hilalticha al mishpatei tzidkecha. And on that, David says, there's 7 a day that I will praise you. 7 are 2 tefillin, 4 tzitzit, and 1 mezuzah. Okay? Even though you could have multiple mezuzah, but they're talking about the mezuzah on your door, the first one, when you walk into the house. Ubisha'ah shenichnas David lebeit hamerchatz. Okay, because they were mentioning David and praising God about the mitzvot and how many mitzvot are surrounding him. But when he went into the Beit Merchatz and he was naked, Ra'at Smo Omed Aron, we saw himself standing naked. Amar Oilish Amod Aron below mitzvah. Woe to me that I am standing now naked before God without any, right? I have no mitzvot on me. Another mitzvah that we really don't have, which is once he saw the Brit Milah on his body, he said, I feel better now. Okay? When he left, because he wasn't going to do it there, he said praise to God. What did he say? Okay, that's one of the Tehillim. Again, the Tehillim are attributed to David, to King David. The Shminit, the 8th. What's the 8th? Okay, a reference al milah she'nina b'shmini, because the Brit Milah is given to be done on the 8th day. Now, there's another reference to 8 here, if you caught it, which is the 7 and then the 8th. Right, and in the world of Kabbalah, the 8th is always, right, there's the 7, and then the 8th is beyond, right? Like usually beyond the nature, right? 7 within, and then that's the ideal. So you could say the Brit Milah is really the piece de resistance, right? The most important of all of them, it's the 8th. That's another way of understanding this 8 here. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Kol sheyesh lo tefillin b'rosho, tefillin b'zro'ot, tzitzit b'bigdo, mezuzah b'pitcho, hakol b'chizuk shelo yechata. If you're wearing all these things on your body and you have your mezuzah on your door, you're protected from sinning. Here they're talking about is 3. Okay, that's a 3-ply thread will not come out very easily. This is a pasuk from Kohelet. You have to really understand the whole context. The beginning of that pasuk is it's really talking about if you're under attack. Okay, what's going to keep you strong is this chud mishulash. What's the chud mishulash here? The 3-ply thread, if you call it. It's the tefillin, mezuzah, and tzitzit. So we have, right? We already had before. We called them 7. Now we're calling them 3 because we're not talking about all the different parts, but we're numbering it in a different way. These 3 mitzvot protect a person. And ve'omer chonem alach Hashem saviv lireirav v'yachatzem. Right, that the angel of God will be around the people who fear Him and will save them. Okay, so the God-fearing people will be protected from sinning. Tanya, Haya Rabbi Meir Omer, Ma nishtana techelet mikol minei tzivonim. Here's the famous drasha about techelet. Why specifically techelet? Mipnei she'techelet domeh liyam. Techelet is like the color of the sea. Hayam domeh l'rakia. The color of the sea is like the color of the firmaments. Okay, now it's missing words here. Okay, in chulin. It's missing the words appear, and Tosfot quotes them. If you see the Tosfot, Dibor Matchil Hachi Garcian on Hey Gimel, Rakia Domel Sapir, and you'll see why you have to read these words, otherwise the continuation makes no sense. Because they're going to start talking about sapphire, and you're like, where does that come from? So the Rakia is the same color as sapphire, and Rakia and sapphire, as a reminder, Sapir is Kisei Kavod. Okay, the sapir is domeh l'kisei hakavod. That reminds you of the kisei hakavod. Okay, that's the throne of God in the heavens. Why does that remind you of this? Why does the sapir remind you of the kisei hakavod? And the idea being that the techelet is supposed to remind you of the sea, which reminds you of the firmament, which reminds you of the sapphire, which reminds you of the kisei hakavod. And then you think about God, and then again that reminds you, keeps you intact, keeps you thinking about the important things in the world. Shene'emal v'tachat raglav k'maaseh livnat hasapir k'etzem hashamayim lator. Okay, under his feet in this kisei hakavod has this vision of it's like sapphire. Okay, so basically you're gonna and like the color of the sky. Uchtiv k'mareh eben sapir demut kisei, and the way a sapphire looks, that's the way the chair, the kisei hakavod of God looks, like a beautiful sapphire. So basically, which is a blue color like the techelet. Okay, and that's the significance of the techelet color. Now, that was introduced with Haya Rabbi Meir Omer. We're now going to have a slew of statements. The next one also has to do with tzitzit, but then we're going to get a little off topic. Tanya Haya Rabbi Meir Omer, Gadol Ansho Shel Lavan Yoter Me'ansho Shel Techelet. If you don't put Lavan in your tzitzit, it's much worse. You're much punished more severely than if you don't put the techelet. Why is that? You would think the techelet was more important, especially after what we just said, but you'll see why in a minute. Mashal Amad Davar Domeh, here's a parable. Understand the concept. Lemelech Basar Vadam, a king who said, Amar L'shnei Avadav, said to two servants, Le'echad Amar Haveli Chotam Shel Tit, bring me a seal of clay. U'le'echad Amar Haveli Chotam Shel Zahav, bring me a seal of gold. U'pashu Shnehem V'lo Hiviu, neither of them brought. Eze Mehem Onshom Merubeh, who gets the bigger sin, punishment? Hevei Omer, Zeh Shamar Haveli Chotam Shel Tit V'lo Hivi, right? It was much easier to bring a clay seal than it is to bring a gold seal. So the one who didn't bring a gold seal, okay, maybe it was hard to find, maybe he couldn't afford it, but the one who didn't bring a clay seal, come on, that's very easy to do. So that's why if you don't do the lavan, it's very easy to do lavan. It's very hard to do techelet, either expensive or hard to find. So you're not going to get punished as much for that than you are for not putting lavan in your beged. Tanya Haya Rabbi Meir Omer. Now we're off to brachot. Chayav Adam levarech mea brachot b'chol yom. You're supposed to say 100 blessings every day. Shneimar Atah Yisrael ma Hashem Elokecha shoel miyimach. Okay, now the Jewish people, what does God ask from you? Where does 100 appear there? Well, ma, they say, is mea, 100. Rav Chia, Bered Rav Avia, B'Shabto, B'Yom Tovei. Okay, now, normally on a normal day, you say Shemona Esrei 3 times a day. That already gets you a lot of brachot, plus brachot HaShachar and brachot HaTorah, and you have a lot of brachot. You go to the bathroom a few times, you basically add to 100 pretty easily. But Shabbos and Yom Tov, where davening usually has 7 blessings and not 18, you need to fill it in. So he would memalele be'is parkmake, he would smell spices, umagde, and eat delicacies, and therefore add brachot to his day. Tanya, Haya Rabbi Meir Omer, Chayav Adam levarech shalosh brachot b'chol yom. There's 3 blessings a person should say. Ve'elu hein. Now here we get to some problems in the girsa. Shasa'ani Yisrael. Okay, you might have Shelo Asani Goy. Okay, that was probably taken out because of the censorship. And Shasa'ani Yisrael got put in. That made me a Jew and not a Gentile. Right? Our version generally is Shelo Asani Goy, but people change it, right? This is one of these things that in modern times people are starting to play with the words of these brachot because they don't sound so pleasant always. Shelo Asani Isha, that you didn't make me a woman, and Shelo Asani Bor, that you didn't make me a fool. Okay, which means someone who doesn't know any Torah. Now that's a less familiar bracha. We don't know that one. Okay, I just want to point out, these appear in Berachot HaShachar, but they're very different than the other ones. Pokeach Ivrim, Matir Asurim, those appear in a different Gemara and brachot. If you remember about when you wake up in the morning, these are the things you're supposed to say. In our davening, they got put together, but these are here possibly to add brachot to your day, okay, so that you get up to 100. It sounds like that's a possible reason why he added them, and they're of a different nature, okay? So now, which one's missing? Shelo Asani Aved, which we say, or Shivcha, that some people change to for women, okay? There's all different versions. And for a woman, by the way, we don't say Shelo Asani Isha, we say Shasani Kirtzono. Okay, again, different people have different versions, but that's in old Sidurim, you can sometimes see this one. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Shamei leBerei, he heard his son, Dahavi Kamavarech Shelo Asani Bor. He heard him saying that bracha, Shelo Asani Bor. Amarle Kulei Hainami. He said, well, they're no different than us. Meaning, what's the point of these brachot? Why are you making these brachot? Right? They seem always people say this is a little offensive, especially to women. What? You're not a woman. So the idea is, right, for a woman. Sorry, that Shasani Kirtzono is what we say. I just said that wrong. Men say Shelo Asani Isha, and we say Shelo Asani Kirtzono. It's just my speed. The biggie. But what's interesting about this is that what it really is saying is, why are you blessing? Because I'm commanded to do mitzvot, and they're exempt from some mitzvot, or non-Jews who are exempt from most mitzvot. And that's what they're trying to say. But a bore, someone who's a fool, is actually obligated just like we are. They just might not understand it all. So, Elamai Mevarech, so what should you say instead? Shelo Asani Eved? Hainu Isha. If you're going to say, let's take a different person who's exempt from mitzvot, but they're in the exact same category as women. Again, not that women are like slaves, and in a second you'll see what the Gemara what he answers to that, but they're both exempt from the same kind of mitzvot. So they say, Eved Zil Tvei. Now Rashi has 2 explanations. The first is, Afilu Hachin Mizulzal Ha'eved Yoter Min Ha'isha. In other words, it's a more degraded place in society. In other words, women are in, again, whether they're in a lower place in society or a similar place in society, they just happen to be exempt from mitzvot. But an Eved is also a slave to somebody else. They're in a different place than women are. And this clearly distinguishes the women from the slave. But Rashi also adds it's a possible other one, which is zil v'hosifu barech shelo asani aved kedei lahashlim. Okay, meaning add it anyway because we want to have more brachot. We want to get to 100, so add it anyway, even though it doesn't really add so much more than the woman. And that is another possible reason about why it got added, which is just interesting in general. Like, it's important to say 100 blessings. On the other hand, we're very careful not to make a bracha levatala. So they obviously thought there was value to these brachot, but you could see that they were kind of added as this extra, like, oh, let's just bless our place in this world, that we can keep mitzvot. You know, we're obligated in all the mitzvot, opposed to women who aren't. Again, it's a bit of it's a hard daf because it's kind of saying women aren't part of these things and don't have the capabilities. On the other hand, it's very interesting because there were different, like Rav Yehuda who put the tzitzit in her baguette. And again, if you go into the extra shirim and see really like what went on in the different generations about how to treat this mitzvah of tzitzit and can women be part of it, you'll be, I think, pleasantly surprised by the openness in a lot of the sources for women wearing tzitzit. So quick review, we started with the idea of b'dikak. You can check actually kali ilan. You can check whether it's really techelet or not, but what you can check in the end is whether it was done lishma, whether it was dyed for testing, or whether it was dyed for the purpose of making tzitzit. And then we got to who can you buy that, right? We said buy from a mumche only, but then we said you really could buy from other people and assume it's good, but depending, right, if the Gentile made it themselves, no. And then we got into the whole thing about why you're not allowed to sell to Gentiles, which came up kind of as an aside. Then we got to Rav Yehuda, who put tzitzit on his wife's beged, but also made a bracha every day, which seemed weird. Why is he making bracha every day if he thinks it's not time-bound? And then from that, we got into the whole machloket about it being a time-bound mitzvah, and what the drashot are on the psukim. And from there, we got off on a big tangent about all this uri temoto and what the significance really of tzitzit are. Many, many drashot on the meaning of that pasuk and what the tzitzit are supposed to remind you of. And from there, we got to what the techelet reminds you of. From there, we got to some other statements of Rabbi Meir, who talked about the 100 brachot and those 3 extra brachot that were added, that we add in the middle of a brachot hashachar, or at the beginning of brachot hashachar. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.